The diplomatic vessel Horizon's Dawn drifted through the cold, expansive space as it approached the massive orbital station above Nexara Prime. Ambassador Daniel Hayes stood at the observation window and watched the structure grow larger with each passing moment. The station was enormous and unlike anything humanity had ever constructed. It stretched across the void like a metal continent and housed representatives from over 200 alien species. Daniel had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, and yet he felt his stomach tighten with uncertainty. Colonel Patricia Moss stood beside him with her arms crossed over her uniform. She was a career military officer and had little patience for diplomatic games. Dr. Vincent Cole sat at a nearby console reviewing his notes on alien biology and cultural practices. Lisa Grant monitored the communication channels and made sure their equipment was functioning properly. The four of them represented humanity's best hope for joining the Galactic Council. The Council had governed the Orion Arm for thousands of years and maintained a fragile peace between hundreds of worlds. Humanity had been aware of their existence for only 15 years, and had spent that time proving themselves worthy of consideration.
5 years ago,
Earth had formally applied for membership, and now after endless delays and bureaucratic procedures, they had finally been invited to present their case. Daniel turned away from the window and addressed his team. The negotiations would be difficult, and the Council had a reputation for arrogance toward younger species. Humanity would need to demonstrate strength without appearing aggressive and show wisdom without seeming naive. Patricia reminded him that Earth's military remained on high alert and could respond within hours if needed. Vincent suggested they emphasize humanity's scientific achievements and cultural diversity. Lisa confirmed that their secure channel to Earth was operational and encrypted. The Horizon's Dawn received docking clearance and maneuvered into one of the station's massive berths. As Daniel and his team disembarked, they were met by a council escort and a protocol officer who explained the procedures they would need to follow. The station's interior was breathtaking and confusing in equal measure. Corridors twisted in impossible directions and gravity shifted without warning. Alien species of every imaginable form moved through the passages, and some acknowledged the humans with curiosity while others ignored them completely. They were led to a waiting chamber outside the main assembly hall. Daniel could hear the rumble of thousands of voices beyond the massive doors. Patricia checked her sidearm out of habit even though weapons were prohibited in the chamber. Vincent reviewed his data one final time. Lisa took several deep breaths to calm her nerves. Daniel straightened his formal diplomatic coat and prepared himself for what lay ahead. The doors opened and they entered the assembly hall. The sight was overwhelming. The chamber was spherical, and delegates from hundreds of species occupied platforms that ringed the interior at various levels. At the center of the sphere floated a raised dais where the most powerful council members sat. Daniel recognized them from his studies. The insectoid Vraxin representative was a fragment of their hive mind, and its chitinous body gleamed under the chamber's lights. The crystalline luminary delegate refracted light in beautiful patterns as it shifted position. The reptilian Korvath commander sat in a throne-like chair, and its scales were covered in ceremonial armor that denoted its high rank. Daniel and his team were directed to a platform near the bottom of the sphere where petitioning species traditionally stood. The position was deliberately humbling and forced them to look up at the council members. High Commander Zexthor of the Korvath Empire spoke first, and its voice was amplified throughout the chamber. The commander acknowledged humanity's petition and invited Daniel to present Earth's case for membership. Daniel stepped forward and began his carefully prepared speech. He spoke of humanity's journey from a divided world to a unified species that had reached for the stars. He described Earth's cultural richness and scientific achievements and commitment to peaceful exploration. He emphasized humanity's desire to contribute to galactic civilization and learn from species with far greater experience. His words were measured and respectful, and he made sure to acknowledge the Council's wisdom and authority. As Daniel spoke, he noticed the reactions around the chamber. Some species seemed genuinely interested and leaned forward to hear better. Others appeared bored or dismissive. The Korvath commander's expression was difficult to read, but Daniel sensed hostility beneath the formal courtesy. The Vraxin fragment remained motionless, and its compound eyes reflected no emotion. The luminary delegate seemed to glow slightly brighter, which Vincent had told him might indicate approval. When Daniel finished, there was a moment of silence before the questioning began. The Korvath commander spoke first, and its tone was sharp. It demanded to know why humanity had expanded so aggressively into nearby systems and built such a large military fleet. Daniel explained that Earth's expansion was driven by population pressure and resource needs, and that the military existed solely for defense against unknown threats. The commander was not satisfied and accused humanity of harboring imperial ambitions. Other council members joined the interrogation. A amphibious species asked about humanity's history of warfare and environmental destruction. A gas cloud entity questioned whether humans could be trusted to follow council directives. A crystalline being similar to the luminary delegate asked about human cultural practices that seemed barbaric to more advanced civilizations. Daniel answered each question as honestly as he could without appearing weak or apologetic. Patricia stood silently beside him, but he could feel her tension. Vincent provided technical data when needed. Lisa recorded everything for transmission back to Earth. The session lasted for hours, and Daniel felt his energy draining. Finally, the Korvath commander announced that the council would deliberate and present their decision at the next assembly. The human delegation was dismissed and escorted back to their quarters on the station. As soon as they were alone, Patricia exploded with frustration. The whole proceeding had been designed to humiliate them, and the questions were hostile rather than genuine inquiries. Vincent agreed and noted that several species had already made up their minds against humanity, before Daniel even spoke. Lisa reviewed the recordings and pointed out subtle exchanges between council members that suggested coordination against Earth's petition. Daniel sat heavily in a chair and tried to process what had happened. He had expected skepticism and even resistance, but the level of contempt surprised him. The council clearly viewed humanity as primitive and dangerous and possibly unworthy of even basic respect. Patricia suggested they leave immediately and report back to Earth, but Daniel insisted they stay and continue negotiations. Walking away would be seen as weakness and confirm the council's worst assumptions about humanity. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself. Daniel and his team attended endless sessions where they presented data and answered questions, and defended humanity's right to exist as equals among the stars. The council's demands grew more extreme with each meeting. They insisted humanity surrender all military vessels beyond the solar system and accept population controls that would limit Earth's expansion and submit to technological inspections that would give the council access to humanity's most sensitive research. Each time Daniel attempted to negotiate more reasonable terms, he was shut down or threatened with rejection. Patricia began conducting her own investigation and discovered disturbing information. Several species whispered that the council had no intention of accepting humanity as equals, and that the entire process was designed to force Earth into vassalage. The Korvath Empire in particular viewed humans as a potential threat to their dominance and had lobbied extensively against the petition. The Vraxen were concerned that humanity's independent nature would disrupt the hive mind philosophy they promoted. Even species that seemed sympathetic admitted they would not risk opposing the Council's major powers. Daniel sent encrypted reports to Earth and warned that the diplomatic mission might fail. President Karen Foster responded with instructions to continue negotiations, but prepare for the worst. Admiral Stephen Cross positioned military assets near human colonies and put defense forces on alert. Dr. Helen Morris accelerated weapons research programs that had been kept secret from Council observers. Earth was preparing for the possibility that diplomacy would not be enough. On the final day of negotiations, Daniel was summoned to the assembly hall alone. The Council had reached its decision. He entered the chamber without his team and stood on the petitioner's platform. High Commander Zexthor announced that the Council would accept humanity's petition under specific conditions and presented a document titled The Treaty of Submission. Daniel read through it quickly and felt his blood run cold. The treaty would reduce Earth to little more than a slave world and strip humanity of sovereignty and military capability and economic independence. It was not membership but conquest through legal language. Daniel looked up at the council members and saw satisfaction on many faces. They expected him to sign out of desperation or fear. Instead, he placed the document on the platform and spoke clearly so everyone could hear. Humanity would not accept these terms, and Earth would rather stand alone than bow to tyranny disguised as civilization. He turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, the chamber erupted in chaos. Daniel Hayes barely made it 10 steps from the assembly hall before Council security forces surrounded him. They were a mixture of species, and each carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. The leader was a towering insectoid warrior from a species Daniel did not recognize, and it clicked its mandibles in what might have been satisfaction. Daniel raised his hand slowly and asked what authority they had to detain a diplomatic envoy under Council law. The insectoid ignored his question and gestured for its squad to restrain him. Back in their quarters, Patricia Moss was reviewing security footage when alarms began blaring throughout the station. She immediately tried to contact Daniel, but the communication channels were jammed. Lisa Grant worked frantically at her console, attempting to break through the interference, while Vincent Cole grabbed what equipment he could carry. Patricia knew something had gone terribly wrong and reached for her sidearm only to remember it had been confiscated upon their arrival. The door to their quarters exploded inward and armed guards flooded the room. Patricia fought back using hand-to-hand combat training, but was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Vincent was stunned unconscious within seconds. Lisa screamed as she was dragged away from her console. All three were bound with energy restraints that burned against their skin and hauled into the corridor. Patricia demanded to know where they were being taken and what had happened to Ambassador Hayes, but the guards remained silent. They were marched through the station's twisting passages as alien species watched with expressions ranging from shock to approval. Daniel was brought to a holding cell deep within the station's lower levels. The room was bare except for a force field that crackled across the entrance. High Commander Zexthor appeared outside the cell, and its reptilian features twisted into something resembling a smile. The commander explained that Daniel had committed a grave offense by refusing the Council's generous offer and insulting the Assembly's authority. Such actions could not go unpunished, and the Council had invoked an ancient law that Daniel's research had somehow missed. The right of sanction was a practice dating back thousands of years to when the Council first formed. It allowed the execution of diplomats who threatened galactic peace through word or deed. The law had not been used in over a century but remained technically valid. Daniel argued that refusing unfair terms was not a threat, and that diplomatic immunity should protect him regardless. Zexthor laughed and said that immunity was a courtesy extended to equals, and humanity had proven itself unworthy of equal status. The execution would proceed at dawn and would be broadcast across Council, space as a lesson to other young species with ambitious ideas. Patricia and the others were thrown into a separate cell where they could see into a large amphitheater through a transparent wall. The space was clearly designed for public spectacles and could hold thousands of observers. Patricia pounded on the wall and shouted threats at any guard who came near, but none responded. Vincent regained consciousness and immediately understood what was happening. Lisa collapsed against the wall and tears streamed down her face. They were going to be forced to watch whatever the Council had planned. The night passed with agonizing slowness. Daniel sat in his cell and thought about Earth and his family, and the future humanity might have had among the stars. He recorded a final message using a hidden device in his diplomatic coat and transmitted it on every frequency he could access in hopes that someone would receive it. The message was simple and direct. He told Earth not to submit and not to accept slavery dressed as membership, and not to let his death be meaningless. Whatever happened next, he wanted humanity to remember that they had tried peace and been answered with barbarism. Dawn came and Daniel was dragged from his cell by a dozen guards. He was brought into the amphitheater where thousands of Council members had gathered to witness the execution. The chamber was filled with species from across the galaxy, and their voices created a deafening roar. At the center of the space stood a tall pillar made of dark metal with restraints built into its surface. Daniel felt his legs weaken but forced himself to walk with dignity. He would not give these creatures the satisfaction of seeing him beg. They bound him to the pillar using restraints that locked around his wrists and ankles and neck. High Commander Zexthor stood before the assembly and delivered a speech about maintaining order and the consequences of defying Council wisdom. The commander's words echoed through the chamber and were translated into hundreds of languages simultaneously. Daniel looked up and saw Patricia pressing her hands against the transparent wall of their cell, and her face was twisted with rage and helplessness. He met her eyes and nodded once to let her know he understood. This was not her fault. Zexthor concluded its speech and gestured to a group of Korvath technicians who activated equipment positioned around the pillar. Daniel recognized the devices as plasma projectors used in industrial applications. His mind raced to understand what they intended, and then horror washed over him as the purpose became clear. They were not going to execute him quickly and mercifully. They were going to burn him alive slowly to maximize his suffering and the lesson it would teach. The first projector activated and a stream of superheated plasma lanced across Daniel's left arm. The pain was beyond anything he had imagined possible, and a scream tore from his throat before he could stop it. The plasma burned through his sleeve and into his flesh, and the smell of cooking meat filled the amphitheater. The crowd watched in silence as the projector moved slowly up his arm toward his shoulder. Daniel tried to pull away, but the restraints held him perfectly still. A second projector activated and targeted his right leg. Then a third focused on his chest. The Korvath technicians worked with clinical precision and ensured the plasma burned hot enough to cause maximum pain without killing him too quickly. Daniel's screams echoed through the chamber, and some species in the audience looked away while others watched with cold interest. The Vraxen fragment recorded everything with its compound eyes. The luminary delegate dimmed its light in what might have been shame. Zexthor stood with arms crossed, and its expression showed satisfaction at a job well done. Patricia threw herself against the transparent wall again and again until her shoulders bled from the impacts. Vincent turned away, unable to watch his friend die in such horror. Lisa sobbed uncontrollably, and her hands covered her face. They could do nothing but witness as Ambassador Daniel Hayes was slowly burned alive before the assembled Galactic Council. The execution took nearly an hour. Daniel's screams eventually faded to whimpers as his body went into shock. His skin blackened and peeled away in strips. His hair ignited and burned to ash. The restraints held his body upright even as his muscles cooked and contracted. Through it all, the council members watched, and some took notes while others discussed the spectacle with academic interest. This was what happened to species who refused to know their place. When Daniel finally died, the plasma projector shut down, and his charred remains slumped against the pillar. High Commander Zexthor announced that the execution was complete, and humanity's remaining representatives would be returned to Earth with a message. Earth had 1 month to accept the Treaty of Submission unconditionally, or the Council would dispatch military forces to enforce compliance. The human species would learn to obey, or they would be eliminated as a threat to galactic peace. Patricia and the others were dragged from their cell and brought before Zexthor. The commander handed Patricia a data chip containing footage of Daniel's execution and instructions for Earth's surrender. Patricia took the chip and met Zexthor's eyes with pure hatred burning in her own. She promised that humanity would respond to this atrocity, and the commander would live just long enough to regret what it had done. Zexthor dismissed her threat as the empty words of a grieving soldier and ordered them taken to their ship. Captain Glenn Pierce had kept the Horizon's Dawn in its berth despite increasing pressure from station security to depart. When Patricia and the others were brought aboard under armed escort, he immediately understood something catastrophic had occurred. The guards provided him with the same data chip and repeated the Council's ultimatum before leaving. As soon as they were gone, Glenn ordered his crew to prepare for immediate departure while Patricia collapsed into a chair and finally allowed herself to break down. Vincent Cole plugged the data chip into their computer system and pulled up the footage. What he saw made him physically ill. Lisa Grant refused to look at the recording again, but her haunted expression told Glenn everything he needed to know. Patricia forced herself to watch the entire execution from beginning to end and committed every detail to memory. This was what the Galactic Council considered justice and diplomacy. Glenn Pierce initiated the departure sequence without waiting for clearance from Station Co. Control. The Horizon's Dawn pulled away from its berth and accelerated toward the system's edge where it could safely engage faster than light travel. Council defense platforms tracked the ship but did not fire, and clearly, they had been ordered to let the humans leave so they could deliver their message of submission to Earth. Glenn had other plans entirely. As soon as the Horizon's Dawn reached minimum safe distance, Glenn activated the ship's communication array and broadcast the execution footage on every frequency toward human space. The transmission would take hours to reach Earth, but it would ensure that humanity knew exactly what had happened to their ambassador. Patricia stood beside him on the bridge and watched the stars stretch into lines as they entered faster than light travel. She spoke quietly and told Glenn that war was coming and nothing would stop it now. Glenn nodded and set course for home. Behind them, the Galactic Council continued its business and was confident that it had successfully intimidated another young species into obedience. They had no idea what they had unleashed. The horizons. Dawn emerged from faster than light, travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, and immediately began broadcasting on all military and civilian frequencies. Captain Glenn Pierce transmitted the execution footage with maximum priority encryption to ensure it reached every human colony and outpost and military installation across 20 star systems. Within minutes, the recording was playing on screens throughout human space, and the reaction was instantaneous. President Karen Foster was in a security briefing at the Geneva headquarters when the footage reached Earth. Her advisors tried to warn her before she watched, but she insisted on seeing what had happened to Ambassador Daniel Hayes. The recording showed every horrific detail of his death, and Karen felt rage building inside her unlike anything she had experienced in 30 years of political life. The men and women around the table sat in stunned silence as the execution played out before them. When it ended, Karen stood and walked to the window overlooking the city below. News networks across Earth began broadcasting the footage within the hour, despite government attempts to control its release. People stopped in the streets to watch public screens showing Daniel's final moments. Parents covered their children's eyes but could not look away themselves. The image of a human diplomat burning alive while alien creatures watched became seared into the collective consciousness of billions. Protests erupted in every major city, and crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding action. The message was clear and unified. Humanity would not accept this atrocity. Admiral Stephen Cross was aboard the orbital command station above Mars when he received the footage. He watched it 3 times to ensure he understood exactly what the Galactic Council had done. His staff officers stood at attention waiting for orders, and many had tears of rage streaming down their faces. Stephen dismissed them and spent an hour alone in his office considering the implications. The Council had committed an act of war disguised as legal execution, and now humanity faced a choice between submission and total conflict against 200 alien species. President Foster addressed the United Earth Assembly 12 hours after the footage reached home. Every human world watched as she stood before the representatives in Geneva and spoke without notes or prepared remarks. She described Daniel Hayes as a man who had dedicated his life to peaceful exploration and cultural exchange and building bridges between humanity and the cosmos. The Council had murdered him not for any crime, but to send a message of intimidation. They wanted humanity to kneel and accept slavery disguised as membership in their corrupt system. Karen's voice grew stronger as she continued, and her words carried across human space with absolute clarity. She declared that humanity would not kneel and would not submit and would not forgive this crime. Earth was formally rejecting the Council's ultimatum and withdrawing all diplomatic overtures. Furthermore, humanity was declaring a state of total war against the Galactic Council and every species that participated in or supported Daniel's execution. The declaration shocked even her own advisors, but the Assembly voted unanimously to support it. Humanity would respond to this atrocity with overwhelming force. The declaration of war sent shockwaves through both human and alien space. Many of Earth's own military leaders questioned whether humanity could possibly win against a coalition of 200 species with thousands of years of technological advancement. Admiral Cross called an emergency meeting of his senior staff and laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Humanity was outnumbered and outgunned and faced enemies with capabilities they barely understood. Every logical analysis suggested that declaring war was suicide, but Admiral Cross had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this scenario. While diplomats had pursued peaceful contact with alien civilizations, the military had been building in secret. Orbital shipyards around Mars and Europa and Titan had constructed not hundreds but thousands of warships using automated manufacturing systems. Earth's colonies had established military academies, producing officers trained specifically for interstellar warfare. Intelligence services had studied every species in the Council and analyzed their tactics in biology and psychology and identified potential weaknesses to exploit. Dr. Helen Morris arrived at the Pentagon within hours of the war declaration and brought with her classified files that only a handful of people knew existed. She briefed President Foster and Admiral Cross on weapons projects that had been kept hidden from Council observers during the diplomatic process. Antimatter torpedoes capable of destroying capital ships with single hits, graviton beam weapons that could tear apart enemy vessels at the molecular level, AI-controlled drone swarms that could overwhelm traditional defenses through sheer numbers and coordination, biological weapons engineered to target specific alien physiologies without harming humans or other species. The most significant revelation was the slipstream drive. While the Galactic Council used predictable, faster-than-light corridors that required specific entry and exit points, the human engineers had developed a completely different approach. The slipstream drive allowed ships to enter and exit faster-than-light travel at any point in normal space, with minimal preparation time. This gave human fleets unparalleled tactical flexibility and the ability to strike anywhere without warning. The Council's defensive strategies were built around controlling corridor access points, and humanity could simply bypass those defenses entirely. Admiral Cross began mobilizing Earth's military forces within hours of the war declaration. General Frank Lopez activated the Expeditionary Corps, and 5 million soldiers in powered armor began boarding transport ships bound for forward operating bases. Naval commanders received orders to disperse their fleets and avoid concentrating forces where Council strikes might destroy them. Intelligence officers initiated deep cover operations in Council space to gather real-time information on enemy movements and defensive positions. The entire human military machine shifted from defensive posture to offensive operations. Captain Glenn Pierce volunteered for a suicide mission before his ship had even finished refueling. He proposed returning to Nexera Prime with a small task force to rescue Patricia Moss and the other survivors, while simultaneously demonstrating that humanity could strike at the heart of Council power. Most military planners considered the mission impossible, but Admiral Cross approved it immediately. Humanity needed to send a message just as brutal as the one the Council had delivered, and destroying their seat of government would achieve that perfectly. Patricia Moss and the others had been released upon reaching Earth, and Patricia immediately requested return to active duty. She met with General Lopez and provided detailed intelligence on the Nexera station's layout and security procedures and defensive systems. She also volunteered to accompany Glenn's strike force despite having just escaped from Council custody. Lopez approved her request and assigned her as military liaison for the operation. Patricia wanted revenge, and the military was prepared to give her that opportunity. The strike force consisted of 6 stealth frigates equipped with the latest slipstream drives and antimatter weapons. Glenn hand-picked his crews from volunteers who understood they might not return. Each ship carried enough firepower to level a small city, and pilots trained to operate in the chaotic environment of close-quarters space combat. They departed Earth 48 hours after the war declaration and vanished into faster-than-light travel before Council agents could track their destination. Meanwhile, Admiral Cross launched the opening moves of Operation Reckoning and humanity's primary offensive strategy. He divided his forces into 50 independent battle groups, each assigned to strike a different Council system simultaneously. The strategy was designed to prevent the Council from concentrating their superior numbers against human fleets and force them to defend everywhere at once. Each battle group had specific objectives ranging from destroying military installations to capturing shipyards to severing supply lines between Council worlds. The Korvath Empire detected the human fleet movements and scrambled to organize a defensive response. High Commander Zexthor had returned to the Korvath homeworld after Daniel's execution, and now found itself coordinating military operations against the species it had just humiliated. Zexthor was confident that Korvath numerical superiority would crush the human uprising within weeks. The commander dispatched 3 heavy dreadnoughts to intercept a human carrier group near the Corvin's gate system and expected an easy first victory. Captain Nicole West commanded the carrier UES Vengeance and received intelligence about the approaching Korvath dreadnoughts 12 hours before they arrived. She positioned her ship near an asteroid field that would provide cover for her fighters and prepared her battle plan when the 3 dreadnoughts emerged from faster-than-light travel exactly where intelligence predicted. Nicole launched her primary weapon system before the enemy could even target her ship. 2,000 AI-controlled combat drones swarmed out of the Vengeances, launch bays and accelerated toward the Korvath vessels. Each drone was barely larger than a fighter craft but carried shaped antimatter charges designed to penetrate capital ship armor. The Korvath commanders had never encountered drone warfare on this scale, and their point defense systems were overwhelmed within seconds. The drones attacked in coordinated waves and exploited gaps in the dreadnoughts, shields and armor to deliver their payloads directly into critical systems. The first dreadnought exploded when antimatter charges breached its reactor core. The second lost all power and began tumbling out of control as its command systems failed. The third attempted to retreat, but drones disabled its faster-than-light drive before it could escape. Nicole ordered boarding teams to secure the crippled vessel and capture any surviving crew for interrogation. The entire engagement lasted less than 30 minutes, and humanity had destroyed or captured 3 of the Korvath Empire's most powerful warships without losing a single human life. News of the victory spread through human space instantly, and morale skyrocketed. Similar successes followed across the warfront as human commanders exploited their tactical advantages against overconfident Council forces. The Vraxen Hive attempted to overwhelm human positions with millions of bioships, but encountered biological weapons that disrupted their hive-mind connections and caused fleet-wide paralysis. Smaller Council species sued for peace after watching their military assets destroyed in one-sided engagements. The carefully maintained image of Council invincibility began cracking. Back at Nexara Prime, the Council leadership convened an emergency session to discuss the human uprising. Many species demanded immediate escalation and total commitment of Council military forces to crush humanity before the rebellion spread. Others argued for diplomatic solutions and suggested that Daniel's execution had been a mistake that should be acknowledged. High Commander Zexthor insisted that humanity would collapse once they faced the Council's full might, but privately the commander felt the first stirrings of doubt. Captain Glenn Pierce and his strike force emerged from faster-than-light travel in the Nexara system 72 hours after leaving Earth. They bypassed Council sensor networks using stealth technology and approached the orbital station from an unexpected vector. Patricia Moss coordinated with resistance elements she had identified during her captivity and guided the team to weak points in the station's defenses. The rescue operation succeeded in extracting several sympathetic aliens who had opposed Daniel's execution and provided additional intelligence on Council military deployments. But Glenn had not come just to rescue prisoners. He had come to send humanity's response to the Galactic Council. Captain Glenn Pierce stood on the bridge of the Horizon's Dawn and watched the massive orbital station of Nexara Prime fill his view screen. Patricia Moss checked her equipment one final time, while the rest of the strike force positioned themselves around the station's vulnerable points. They had successfully extracted the prisoners, and now came the part of the mission that everyone knew would change everything. Glenn opened a channel to his other 5 frigates and gave the order to arm antimatter torpedoes. The Council security forces had not detected the human ships yet because the stealth systems were functioning perfectly. Glenn calculated the trajectories needed to hit the station's primary power cores and distributed targets among his vessels. Each frigate would fire simultaneously to maximize damage before the station's defenses could respond. Patricia moved to stand beside him and asked if he was certain about this course of action. Glenn nodded and reminded her that the Council had declared war when they burned Daniel Hayes alive, and now humanity was simply answering. The 6 frigates, fired as 1 in 12 antimatter torpedoes, streaked toward the station at incredible velocity. The weapons moved too fast for point defense systems to intercept and struck their targets within seconds of launch. The first explosion tore through the station's northern power core and sent a cascade of secondary detonations rippling through connected systems. The second blast destroyed the central reactor that provided life support to millions of Council delegates. Additional torpedoes struck docking bays and communication arrays and defensive platforms. Glenn watched as the massive station began tearing itself apart from the inside. Sections broke away and tumbled into space while atmosphere vented from thousands of breaches. Emergency beacons activated across the structure, but there was no time for evacuation. The antimatter reactions triggered feedback loops in the station's power grid and caused catastrophic failures throughout the entire complex. Within minutes, the orbital station that had served as the Council's seat of government for thousands of years was transformed into a spreading field of debris. Patricia thought of Daniel Hayes, burning alive while council members watched with cold satisfaction. She thought of High Commander Zexthor delivering its speech about maintaining order and teaching young species their place. The commander had been on that station and was now dead along with thousands of other council delegates and staff. Patricia felt no guilt and no remorse. The council had wanted to teach humanity about consequences, and now they were learning that lesson themselves. Glenn transmitted a message on all council frequencies before initiating retreat. His words were simple and direct and left no room for misinterpretation. The council had wanted to teach humanity fear through the murder of a diplomat under a flag of peace. They had failed completely. Now humanity would teach the council what real fear meant. Every council member who had participated in or supported Daniel's execution would be hunted down and destroyed. Every species that stood with the council would face the full wrath of humanity's military machine. This was not a warning but a promise. The strike force engaged their slipstream drives and vanished before council defense fleets could respond. They scattered in different directions to avoid pursuit and rendezvoused at a predetermined location 3 systems away. Glenn's crews celebrated their successful strike, but he remained focused on the larger picture. Destroying Nexara Prime was a symbolic victory that would boost human morale, but the real war was just beginning. Admiral Cross had deployed 50 battle groups across council space, and those forces would determine whether humanity could actually win this conflict. The destruction of the Nexara station sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. Council leadership had to relocate to temporary facilities on various homeworlds while they argued about how to respond. The Korvath Empire demanded immediate retaliation and total commitment of all Council military forces to crush humanity. The Vraxan Hive calculated probabilities and determined that humanity posed a genuine threat to Council stability. The Luminary Collective questioned whether continuing the war served anyone's interests given the costs already incurred. Admiral Cross pressed his advantage while the Council remained disorganized. His battle group struck deep into Council territory and targeted military installations and shipyards and supply depots. Human commanders used hit-and-run tactics that exploited the slipstream drive's ability to appear and disappear without warning. Council forces found themselves constantly reacting to human initiatives rather than executing their own strategies. The psychological impact was devastating as species that had never known defeat suddenly faced an enemy they could not predict or contain. The Battle of Corvin's Gate had been only the beginning. Captain Nicole West and the UES Vengeance continued hunting Korvath battle groups and destroying them with minimal losses. Her drone swarms proved devastatingly effective against traditional capital ships that relied on heavy armor and powerful weapons. The Korvath commanders could not adapt quickly enough to counter the new tactics, and their fleets suffered catastrophic losses across multiple systems. High Commander Zexthor's replacement demanded reinforcements, but the Korvath reserves were already stretched, thin trying to defend their core worlds. General Frank Lopez landed the Expeditionary Corps on a dozen council worlds simultaneously. His troops did not come to conquer or occupy but to dismantle military infrastructure and liberate populations subjugated by the Council's dominant powers. Human soldiers in powered armor moved through alien cities and destroyed weapons, factories and military academies and government facilities. They left civilian populations largely unharmed and distributed food and medical supplies to demonstrate that humanity's war was with the Council leadership and not ordinary citizens. The propaganda effect was immense. Smaller species that had been forced into Council membership began questioning their allegiance. Some secretly contacted human commanders and offered intelligence in exchange for protection from Korvath or Vraxan retaliation. Others declared neutrality and refused to commit forces to the Council's defense. The carefully maintained facade of Council unity began crumbling as species pursued their own survival rather than collective defense. The Vraxan Hive attempted to turn the tide through sheer numbers. They deployed millions of bioships grown specifically for combat and sent them in massive waves against human positions. The strategy had worked for centuries against other Council species, but humanity had prepared specifically for this threat. Dr. Helen Morris had developed biological weapons that targeted the pheromone-based communication system the Vraxan used to coordinate their hive mind. When human forces released These weapons into Vraxan battle formations, the results were immediate and horrifying. Vraxan bioships lost contact with their hive mind and began attacking each other or drifting aimlessly through space. Entire fleets descended into chaos as individual ships reverted to base instincts without higher coordination. The Hive Queen watched in horror as centuries of biological engineering were countered by human ingenuity in a matter of months. The Vraxan suffered losses they could not replace quickly enough and were forced to withdraw from several key systems to regroup and develop countermeasures. 6 months after the war began, humanity had conquered or destroyed military assets in 30 council systems. The pace of advance shocked even human military planners who had expected much fiercer resistance. Admiral Cross reviewed the strategic situation and realized the council had relied too heavily on intimidation and reputation rather than actual military preparedness. Their technology was advanced, but their tactics were outdated and their commanders lacked experience against a peer opponent. Humanity's willingness to embrace unconventional warfare and accept casualties gave them an edge that superior technology could not overcome. But the war was far from over. The Council still commanded vastly superior numbers and controlled hundreds of systems with trillions of inhabitants. Several major species had not yet committed their full military strength and were building new fleets specifically designed to counter human advantages. The Korvath Empire began developing their own drone warfare capabilities. The Vraxan experimented with decentralized hive mind structures that would be harder to disrupt. The Luminari shared advanced shielding technology with other Council species to help defend against antimatter weapons. President Karen Foster addressed humanity again 6 months into the war, and her message was both triumphant and cautionary. Human forces had achieved remarkable victories and proven that the Council was not invincible. Daniel Hayes had been avenged many times over, and the species responsible for his murder now lived in fear of human retaliation. But the war would continue for months or years more, and would cost countless lives before peace could be achieved. She asked humanity to remain resolute and support the military effort, and remember why they fought. Admiral Cross planned the next phase of Operation Reckoning with his senior staff. The initial strikes had crippled Council coordination and destroyed significant military assets, but now came the harder part. Humanity needed to break the will of the Council's major powers and force them to accept that continuing the war would result in their complete destruction. This meant targeting homeworlds and population centers in ways that would demonstrate humanity's capacity for total war while still maintaining some moral restraint. The Korvath homeworld became the primary target. High Commander Zexthor's successor had consolidated power and rallied the Korvath military for a massive counteroffensive aimed at Earth itself. Admiral Cross decided to strike first and launched an armada of 300 warships toward the Korvath home system. The battle group included carriers and dreadnoughts and support vessels, carrying enough firepower to sterilize a planet. Admiral Cross personally commanded the operation from his flagship and made clear that this would be humanity's definitive statement. The Korvath detected the approaching human fleet days before it arrived and prepared their strongest defense. Every available warship was recalled to protect the homeworld, and orbital defense platforms were activated around the planet. Millions of Korvath warriors swore to die defending their ancestral home. The Korvath leadership broadcast messages throughout Council space declaring that humanity would finally meet their match and be crushed by superior numbers and courage. Patricia Moss served as Admiral Cross's tactical advisor. During the approach to the Korvath system, she reviewed intelligence reports and identified weaknesses in their defensive formations. The Korvath had concentrated their forces around the planet itself, but left their outer system installations relatively undefended. Patricia suggested destroying those positions first to eliminate fallback options and force the Korvath to commit everything to the planet's defense. Admiral Cross approved the plan and ordered his battle groups to execute. Human forces emerged from faster-than-light travel at multiple points throughout the Korvath system. They struck mining stations and refueling depots and communication relays with overwhelming firepower. The Korvath fleet commander had to decide whether to defend these outlying positions or maintain concentration around the homeworld. He chose to hold position, and humanity systematically destroyed every Korvath asset in the outer system. The psychological impact was devastating, as the Korvath military watched helplessly while their Infrastructure burned. Admiral Cross brought his main fleet to the edge of the Korvath homeworld's defensive perimeter and opened a communication channel. He spoke directly to the Korvath leadership and offered them one chance to surrender unconditionally. If they refused, humanity would demonstrate exactly what total war meant, and the Korvath species would pay a price that would echo through history. The Korvath commander rejected the offer with contempt and ordered his forces to attack. Admiral Cross closed the channel and gave the order to commence operations. The battle for the Korvath homeworld lasted 18 hours and became the bloodiest engagement of the entire war. Human carriers launched waves of drones that swarmed the Korvath defensive fleet, while capital ships fired antimatter torpedoes into their formations. The Korvath fought with desperate courage and destroyed dozens of human vessels through sheer weight of numbers. Admiral Stephen Cross watched from his flagship as casualty reports climbed into the thousands, but he did not waver from his objective. The Korvath needed to understand that defying humanity carried an absolute price. Captain Nicole West commanded a strike group tasked with eliminating the Korvath orbital defense platforms. Her drones penetrated the defensive perimeter and delivered shaped charges into the platform's structural weak points. Each platform that exploded represented years of Korvath engineering and centuries of strategic planning. Nicole felt no satisfaction in the destruction, but understood its necessity. The Council had chosen barbarism when they burned Daniel, Hayes alive, and now they were reaping what they had sown. The Korvath fleet commander made a final desperate gambit and ordered his remaining ships to ram the human capital vessels. Several Korvath dreadnoughts accelerated on collision courses with Admiral Cross's flagship, but were intercepted by human frigates that sacrificed themselves to protect the command ship. The exchange cost humanity valuable ships and personnel, but broke the spine of Korvath resistance. Their fleet dissolved into scattered groups that could no longer coordinate effectively against human tactics. Admiral Cross opened another communication channel to the Korvath leadership as human forces established orbital superiority. The planet below was defenseless, and humanity possessed the firepower to exterminate every Korvath on their homeworld within hours. Cross made clear that this was their final opportunity to surrender unconditionally. If they refused, he would order planetary bombardment, and the Korvath species would cease to exist. The choice belonged to them alone. The Korvath Supremacy Council convened in their underground bunker and debated furiously. Some members demanded continued resistance even if it meant extinction. Others argued that survival required accepting defeat regardless of the humiliation involved. The debate raged for 2 hours while human warships orbited above and weapons remained trained on population centers. Finally, the Korvath High Council transmitted their unconditional surrender to Admiral Cross. The surrender of the Korvath Empire sent shockwaves throughout Council space that exceeded even the destruction of Nexara Prime. The Korvath had been one of the 3 dominant powers in the Council for millennia, and now they knelt before a species that had joined galactic civilization only 15 years earlier. Dozens of smaller species that had aligned with the Council out of fear rather than conviction began reconsidering their positions. If the mighty Korvath could fall, then no one was safe from humanity's wrath. The Vraxen Hive faced similar pressure as human forces closed in on Hive Prime. The Hive Queen had watched the Korvath defeat with cold calculation and understood that continued resistance would only result in more losses. The biological weapons humanity deployed had proven devastatingly effective against the Vraxen coordination systems, and the Hive could not develop countermeasures quickly enough. The Queen made a decision that went against every instinct of the collective consciousness but served the survival imperative above all else. The Vraxen contacted Admiral Cross through intermediaries and proposed terms for their surrender. The Hive Queen offered to withdraw all Vraxen military forces from Council operations and provide intelligence on other species' defensive capabilities in exchange for humanity sparing Hive Prime from attack. Admiral Cross consulted with President Karen Foster, and they agreed to accept the Vraxen terms with additional conditions. The Hive would stand trial for their participation in Daniel Hayes' execution and would pay reparations to humanity for the next century. The Luminary Collective had remained mostly neutral throughout the war and now sought to position themselves as mediators. Crystal Singer Villana traveled to Earth under diplomatic immunity and requested an audience with President Foster. The Luminary delegate arrived in Geneva and was escorted through streets lined with memorials to the fallen. Velana saw images of Daniel Hayes displayed throughout the city and understood the depth of humanity's grief and rage. President Foster met Velana in a private chamber and listened as the luminary explained that many council species had opposed Daniel's execution but lacked the power to prevent it. The Korvath and Vraxen had dominated council politics for too long and used fear to maintain control over hundreds of worlds. Velana argued that dissolving the council entirely would create power vacuums that could lead to even worse conflicts. She proposed instead a reformed galactic organization based on principles of equality and mutual defense. Karen Foster considered the proposal carefully. Humanity had gone to war to avenge Daniel Hayes and destroy the corrupt system that murdered him. They had achieved both objectives beyond anyone's expectations, but creating a stable peace required more than military victory. She told Velana that humanity would accept nothing less than the complete dissolution of the Galactic Council and war crimes trials for everyone responsible for Daniel's death. However, Earth would consider participating in a new interstellar organization if it met specific conditions. The conditions were non-negotiable. Every species would have equal representation regardless of military power or economic strength. No species could be forced into membership against their will. Diplomatic immunity would be absolute, and any violation would result in immediate expulsion and sanctions. Most importantly, the organization would exist to facilitate cooperation rather than enforce submission. Velana agreed to present these terms to the surviving council leadership and departed Earth with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. General Frank Lopez oversaw the occupation of former council military installations across dozens of systems. Human forces worked to dismantle weapons production facilities and redistribute resources to populations that had been exploited by the council's dominant powers. Lopez implemented strict rules of engagement to prevent unnecessary casualties and ordered his troops to provide humanitarian aid wherever possible. The goal was to demonstrate that humanity offered a better alternative to council tyranny rather than simply replacing one oppressor with another. Dr. Helen Morris led scientific teams studying captured council technology and reverse engineering systems that could benefit humanity. She made certain that any breakthrough was shared with allied species rather than hoarded for Earth's exclusive advantage. This generosity surprised many aliens who expected humanity to behave like the Council had and keep the best technology for themselves. Morris understood that building trust required demonstrating through actions that humanity's vision of galactic civilization was fundamentally different. The war formally ended 14 months after Daniel Hayes died screaming in the Nexera Prime Amphitheater. The Galactic Council dissolved following votes by member species to abandon the organization. War crimes tribunals began on Earth with human judges presiding over cases against council officials who had participated in or ordered Daniel's execution. Some defendants were sentenced to long prison terms while others received lesser punishments, depending on their level of involvement. High Commander Zexthor was already dead, but its legacy lived in infamy. President Foster announced the creation of the Terran Commonwealth during a ceremony broadcast across human and alien space. The new organization would operate from headquarters on Earth and welcome any species committed to peaceful cooperation and mutual defense. Membership was voluntary and required only that participants respect the sovereignty of other members and abide by common laws protecting diplomatic personnel. Over 50 species applied for membership within the first month, including many that had belonged to the old Council. Colonel Patricia Moss received promotion to general and became the Commonwealth's first military commander. She established training programs to ensure human and alien forces could operate together effectively. Patricia never forgot watching Daniel Hayes burn alive and made certain that every officer under her command understood the principles he died defending. The Commonwealth military would exist to protect the innocent rather than intimidate the weak. Dr. Vincent Cole led rebuilding efforts on worlds devastated by the war. He coordinated with alien scientists to develop technologies that could restore damaged ecosystems and repair infrastructure. Vincent viewed the reconstruction as humanity's opportunity to prove their commitment to the ideals Daniel had articulated during his final diplomatic mission. Earth would be judged not by how they won the war but by how they built the peace. Lisa Grant established new diplomatic protocols for the Commonwealth that protected ambassadors and ensured their safety under all circumstances. She created training programs for human and alien diplomats emphasizing cultural understanding and peaceful conflict resolution. Lisa carried guilt that she survived while Daniel died but channeled that pain into making certain no other diplomat would face his fate. Earth dedicated a monument to Daniel Hayes in Geneva where President Foster had declared war. The monument was a simple pillar of polished stone with Daniel's face carved into one side and his final words on the other. Humanity will not kneel. The inscription became a rallying cry for the Commonwealth and a reminder to all species of what happened when arrogance met determination. Thousands of humans and aliens visited the monument each year to pay respects to the man whose death changed the galaxy. Admiral Stephen Cross stood on the observation deck of his flagship and looked out at a transformed galaxy. The council that ruled through intimidation for millennia was gone and replaced by an alliance built on respect rather than fear. Humanity had proven itself through violence but now worked to prove itself through compassion and wisdom. Cross understood the irony completely. The Council feared humanity would be too aggressive, and their fear caused them to commit an atrocity that unleashed exactly the war they sought to prevent. Captain Glenn Pierce returned to civilian service after the war and wrote a detailed account of the diplomatic mission and Daniel's execution and humanity's response. His book became required reading in Commonwealth academies and served as both historical record and cautionary tale. Glenn never glorified the war or celebrated the deaths it caused, but he made certain readers understood why humanity fought and what they fought to protect. The galaxy slowly adapted to its new reality. Species that had been enemies learned to cooperate. Worlds that suffered under Council oppression rebuilt with Commonwealth assistance. Trade networks expanded and cultural exchanges flourished. Not everything was perfect, and tensions remained between former adversaries, but the trend moved toward cooperation rather than conflict. The Terran Commonwealth was not paradise, but it offered something the Galactic Council never had, which was hope that tomorrow might be better than today. President Karen Foster visited Daniel Hayes' monument on the anniversary of his death each year. She would stand before the polished stone and remember the man who believed diplomacy could bridge any divide. Daniel had been wrong about the Council, but right about humanity. They possessed the strength to fight when necessary, and the wisdom to build peace when possible. Karen believed Daniel would approve of what humanity created from the ashes of his death, even if he would mourn the cost required to achieve it. The monument's inscription caught the light as the sun set over Geneva. Humanity will not kneel. 4 simple words that contained everything Daniel Hayes died defending, and everything humanity fought to preserve. Those words would echo through the centuries as a reminder that freedom earned through sacrifice was worth any price, and that those who mistake mercy for weakness do so at their own peril.